The Pottinger's cat experiment showed that taurine was an absolutely critical element of nutrition. Cats make very little taurine as they are predators who consume small animals whole. This provides a large amount of taurine in their natural diet. Dogs make much more taurine than cats do, but it has been found that it still must be supplemented in dog food, or else they get cardiomyopathy in their later years. Lately, grainless dog foods have become popular, and this is a giant step in the right direction as dogs, like humans, are simply not equipped to deal with processed grain kibble. The average lifespan of a golden retriever, for example, has gone down by over 10 years since the 30s. You might think this is genetic, but more and more evidence shows that it is the food. It's also borne out by the fact cardiomyopathy has gone up even more since grainless foods have come on the market. It's typically made of cuts of meat that simply don't have the required taurine to keep a dog optimally healthy. While in the short term, this might be fine and dogs might seem to do well, in the long term, they're getting more and more cardiomyopathy and deficiencies that cause lots of problems in their old age. Interestingly, humans also mainly eat cuts of meat that are largely devoid of taurine. What's more, while humans do make some taurine within the body, provided they eat enough methionine, they make much less of it than dogs do. This implies humans, like cats, have a strong need for dietary taurine. You might think it's normal for humans to have heart disease in their 60s and 70s, but not long ago we didn't. This could well be one of the reasons why we do today. Just like the dogs, who seldom had cardiomyopathy 100 years ago, and now have it as a leading cause of death. And cardiomyopathy is sort of like the dog version of heart disease. So even if you've totally kicked junk food to the curb, you might want to think twice about how healthy your diet really is.
I thought I was blind without my glasses, but I was just blind. Oh, how could I be so stupid?
We told you every freaking time, but did you ever listen to Scoob and me? No!
Just to make it clear from the beginning, taurine and glycine are both heat stable. The reason that grainless dog foods are often low in taurine is simply that they don't exist in the cuts of meat being used in these foods. That's also true of hamburger and steak. Even if you're on a carnivore diet eating 100% meat, you are probably still deficient in taurine and glycine as compared to our ancestral diet. Unless you are going to have bone broth with every meal and eat beef heart daily, or lots and lots of seafood, you are simply going to be deficient in taurine and glycine, and that's all there is to it. I've been very clear about this every time I talk about these issues, but I still get people who say that's not the case. They continue to insist that raw food is the answer, not whole food, or even that I said that it's raw food and not whole food. You need whole animal products, which includes the glycine, which comes from the bones, which are made of collagen, and which comes from the small muscles we generally don't eat and is not in hamburger, such as on the oxtail, the ox neck, the face, the tongue, the heart, and so on. Perhaps the main lesson from the work of Francis Pottinger is that deficiency can take a very long time to show itself, and it can get progressively worse from generation to generation. This is why the current fiasco is occurring, because nutritionists and manufacturers today just cannot understand the idea that nutrition issues cannot be detected or corrected overnight. So they have seen deaths rise in dogs, but they could not get an overnight fix by adding in more taurine, so they discard it as a possible cause. In reality, taurine is involved in protein folding for every single process in the body involving the construction of proteins from amino acids. It is critical during development, but also has significant effects over time. For example, after taking taurine for about 6 months, I noticed some burns on my arms from decades ago had essentially disappeared. Even fasting had not shown any effect on this, so I was not even looking for this to happen, and I just noticed it one day, and at first I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't believe my eyes. I've never seen any studies on taurine for use in burns, but it does make sense it could help because fibrosis in organs like the heart is really the same thing, it's scarring. And taurine has been shown many times to help with fibrosis, especially in heart failure. It would probably also help a great deal if you have fibrosis in your lungs. This is also probably why you see vegans do well for years. Then they don't look so great and suddenly things completely implode because long-term deficiency slowly catches up with them.
The fascinating thing about the Pottinger cat studies is that in many ways they tie in with some of Dr. Price's research. Pottinger found that in the 3 groups of cats, which he isolated and fed diets ranging from all raw to 1/3 raw and 2/3 cooked, exhibited certain skeletal changes over the generations of the cats. The groups that were fed more of the cooked diet and less proportionally of the raw diet started developing and showed skeletal deformities primarily in the skull itself. And this is interesting because Price found the same thing with the primitive groups that he visited. When they had gone on refined foods, he also noticed, and you'll see the pictures in his book, Nutritional and Physical Degeneration, the narrowing of the jaw, the lifting of the upper palate, and the crowding of the teeth, which shows that the diet for cats that were fed the more proportions of the cooked food was not proper for that particular kind of animal. They weren't getting some of the nutrients that were needed to build proper skeletal shapes. And it was the same thing with the peoples. Now, when one looks around today, we can see a lot of evidence of the kind of diets that we have degenerated into as a society to a greater or lesser extent.
Taurine deficiency is an especially big problem for vegans because while most people today are deficient, vegans don't get any in the diet at all. Worse, the little taurine that can be made in the body is made from dietary methionine. All plant proteins are deficient in methionine, and this is the critical area where plant proteins just fail to work properly. It's also low in leucine, which causes other problems, but the main problem is the lack of methionine means they can't make taurine internally nearly as well as someone who eats meat. Methionine is also required for the body to make glutathione. This is why vegans have dramatically worse problems with oxidative damage, in addition to the problems they get with glycation from eating vastly more carbs than our ancestors did, and they essentially ate almost zero carbs. They will try to say that limiting methionine means you will have less homocysteine in the body, but in reality, homocysteine is a byproduct of the body producing taurine and glutathione. This is not a problem in those with a healthy liver, but if you have metabolic syndrome from a high-carb diet, then your liver will not be able to properly detoxify this byproduct. Homocysteine probably sounds familiar to anyone who's bought NAC before. That's not a coincidence because the cysteine in NAC is part of what's used by the body to create glutathione, and this is created from methionine. Glutathione is the master antioxidant of the body, not vitamin C, and that's what counters the production of ROS, or reactive oxygen species, and many other harmful toxic byproducts of metabolism, as well as things that you could ingest. If you're unconvinced you need taurine, just think what happens if you eat enough that your body doesn't need to make it. No homocysteine is produced at all. This alone makes prioritizing taurine as a nutrient one of the smartest moves you could ever make. In fact, I would say just supplement it unless you plan to eat beef heart and beef tongue daily. The more you can get, the better, and there's really no harm from too much. The only thing that's going to happen is you're going to produce less homocysteine, and you're going to have much better skin. Personally, I take 6 grams a day. You can also apply this logic to the cysteine in NAC. You not only produce more glutathione when you take in L-cysteine, but you are also producing less homocysteine from methionine. This could make a quite profound difference in the body over time, especially for heart disease. We take for granted that heart disease is just normal today, but one of the biggest contributing factors is that homocysteine just goes up and up with age, and this causes a great deal of inflammation. Just make sure you don't actually get NAC, which is essentially a scam. NAC was dreamed up by Big Pharma because you can't patent a natural amino acid within the body. The real active ingredient is L-cysteine. L-cysteine is about half the price of NAC and has around twice the active ingredient. Some of these NAC capsules are quite expensive, but a kilo of L-cysteine from a quality manufacturer runs around $30. It is also very safe because it's wholly synthetic from simple compounds, and that's also true for taurine. I currently take 3 grams of L-cysteine a day. I find it tastes okay mixed with other powders, but beware that most people seem to dislike the taste, and that's the only real drawback to this supplement. You may think I chose the name Pottinger's Human because I was planning to make a health-related channel, but in reality I chose that name long before I started making videos. I chose it because I've noticed all around me that people seem to be changing in a real, physical way. They also seem to be changing mentally, and not in a positive way.
What is this?
A center for ants?
How can we be expected to teach children to learn how to read if they can't even fit inside the building?
In Dr. Pottinger's cat experiments, the cats had somewhat abnormal skulls, jaws, teeth, and also brains. Bones are actually mainly made of collagen, not calcium, and taurine is heavily involved in this process, along with all protein synthesis in the body. They also form around the brain in a shape largely dictated by the structure of the brain, so big changes in skull shape and size means there's also big changes underneath the skull and in the function of the brain itself. That was borne out by the behavior of the cats, many of which were very aggressive, highly passive, or displayed signs of mental illness and other abnormalities. I see a lot of this in the people around me today, and it makes me wonder how much of a contributing factor diet is. In my neighborhood, there are a bunch of stray cats that come by begging for food every morning. They have unusually small heads, and I have to think this is due to the packaged food the neighbors give them being low in taurine. To be blunt, I also see this issue in a lot of the people around too. The first case of asthma in the cat was discovered by Dr. Pottinger among the subjects that had the low taurine diet. This makes sense as all allergic reactions start in the gut. It is the gut that filters out large protein strands, and these large strands of protein become attacked by the immune system, and that's basically what an allergic reaction is. If you don't have a leaky gut, then you can't really have this issue in the first place. And if you do have a leaky gut, then autoimmune disease is going to be in your future. Taurine does a great deal to seal the junctures of the gut lining and to keep this from happening, and glycine is also going to help in this regard. As an osmolyte, taurine keeps fluid from going where it's not supposed to, and ensures it does go where it is supposed to. This is critical for the gut, for cell membranes, and also for mitochondria. Taurine also has a profound effect on the mitochondria, which is part of the reason it is so helpful in heart failure patients. This is true for both humans and dogs, with long-term trials performed in Japan. It also can't be understated how important mitochondria are for mental health. Virtually all mental illness has mitochondrial involvement, including dementia.
What I am arguing is that when people's brains are malfunctioning and resulting in symptoms of chronic depression or anxiety or bipolar symptoms or psychotic symptoms, that the reason for that, the foundational reason for the brain to malfunction in those ways is metabolic.
Taurine can help a great deal here, along with fasting and a low-carb diet. Glycine also helps a great deal with mitochondrial function, and has been used experimentally for schizophrenia symptom relief. Glycine is another issue with the modern diet, and it simply does not exist in large amounts in muscle meat or in plant sources. This is typically the limiting factor in collagen production, the active component if you will. You can take expensive collagen supplements, but they're only about 20% glycine by weight, and they must be broken down by the body before being absorbed. This means you get 5 times the effect on collagen production by simply taking glycine as opposed to taking collagen itself. You might want to avoid collagen for other reasons too, and that's because glycine is chemically very similar to the carcinogen glyphosate, and collagen is often contaminated with glyphosate because the cows or pigs or whatever take it up into their body and the body sees it as glycine. Glyphosate has been banned in many places and will probably be banned everywhere eventually. I'm sure the companies responsible will be very apologetic as always, and they'll have something even worse in store for us, again as always.
I'm sorry I caused all that cancer. You don't even sound like you mean it, Bruce.
Dave, you asked me to apologize, and that's just what I did. I'm sorry I caused all that throat cancer and all that bowel cancer. I was just on a roll.
And that will be cold comfort for all those who develop cancer in the meantime, most of whom won't even know what the source is because there's so many things in our environment today that can cause it. Gelatin is just cheap collagen, and it's usually from pork. So don't think you can take cheap gelatin as a substitute for glycine or collagen. It's still more expensive than pure glycine, and much more contaminated than a good and very expensive collagen supplement. Even organic collagen supplements are going to have some glyphosate content, and cheap gelatin will be much worse. As with taurine, you will have to either radically change what you eat to get ancestral amounts, or supplement it. I take 6 grams of glycine a day, but if you have bone broth with every meal, you could get enough that way. Taurine and glycine are both very important for your gut health, and also for your skin health, which seems to be very important to most people. Since dog food issues are what inspired this video, you might wonder what I actually feed my dogs. I mostly feed them what I eat day to day, brisket and other beef roasts, slowly cooked along with bones to make broth, and then I use the broth for gravy, which is a good way to make sure you get all that taurine and glycine that accumulate in that broth. I'll also get chicken thighs and cook them down and strain out the bones. Chicken thighs are a good source of taurine, and turning it into soup also provides a great deal of glycine from the skin and bones. Skinless, boneless chicken breast, on the other hand, is largely devoid of nutrients. It does have protein, but that's about it. I also give them some supplemental taurine every day, about 100 milligrams per 10 pounds of body weight. This is very similar to what a Mastiff breeder I saw on YouTube feeds his dogs. Eating kibble, they were only living about 8 years on average, and that's actually pretty typical for very large dog breeds. But once he switched them to a raw diet with plenty of bones and skin and organs, their lifespan almost doubled to about 15 years on average. That's because this is the nutrition your dog would be getting eating its natural diet. And remember, this is also your natural diet. In fact, humans are more dependent on taurine than dogs because they can't make as much taurine as the dogs do. And humans are also unable to gnaw on a bone and get out all the marrow and get all of the glycine from the bone directly like a dog can. The Ice Age lasted over 1 million years, arguably 2 million years, and we're just coming out of it now. Everyone knows Europe was covered in ice until around 12,000 years ago, but few people realized just how much ice was covering the planet. In fact, South Africa had ice on it only a few thousand years ago, much later than Europe did, and at the same time, South America was covered in even more ice. And we can analyze isotopes in ancient bone samples and see what our ancestors were eating. And it turns out they ate a diet of nearly 100% meat. Now, they did eat just about anything they could get their hands on, but most of the time that's all that was available. The climate worldwide was much colder than today and mostly tundra, which is basically big fields of grass, and there's no foliage there to eat that's edible by humans. We had to hunt things like woolly mammoths and oryx, which are gigantic versions of cows that are the ancestors of cows. And that's how we got all of our nutrition. It would simply be impossible for humans to get a large portion of their diet from plants at this time. It would be like trying to live as a vegetarian in the Canadian wilderness. You could manage that for a brief period during the summer, but most of the time it would just be impossible to get anything to eat. The diet we have today is much more recent than people realize. The population of the planet exploded after the invention of antibiotics. In the past, people concentrated into cities would periodically get wiped out by disease, especially in times of famine and bad weather. In more tropical environments, disease kept the populations from ever growing into large cities in the first place. You may have heard the story of Hansel and Gretel, but it's based on real history. There was a gigantic famine in the 1300s, and it's believed that cannibalism and turning out your children into the forest became very common in this period. And during these times, those with poor nutrition fared much worse than others. Diseases that couldn't really take someone out today who was young and healthy could easily take you out back then because you were malnourished, at least during certain time periods. While Ireland is known for the potato famine today, it was only after Cromwell conquered Ireland and sold huge amounts of the population off as slaves in Barbados that potatoes became the main food source for the Irish. That's because 95% of the land was stolen from the Irish, and high-yield potato farming was the only way most of the population could produce enough food to feed themselves at all. Before that, mutton and beef were the ethnic Irish foods of choice, and there's recipes for corned beef going back as far as Irish writing goes. Sadly, even the politicians in Ireland, who were actually mostly English, did not care to do much to relieve the famine, and they may have even contributed to causing it in the first place.
It's said that the Sultan offered to donate £10,000, and he was actually convinced to lower that to £1,000 so as not to outshine the £2,000 donation that Queen Victoria made.
Just like today, much of the scarcity was artificial in nature, and it mainly benefited a few wealthy people, not the English people as a whole. It was just a few very wealthy people making all the profits. And also like today, the politicians were largely just mouthpieces of a few rich and powerful people who would rather not step forward to take direct responsibility for the policies that they are actually forcing onto everyone. In East Asia and much of Europe, seafood was the staple food not very long ago. Only due to population explosion and shortages due to the rise of communism in Asia has a cheap plant-based diet become the norm. Seafood is the best source of taurine, and until very recently seafood was the main staple food of a huge percentage of not just Asia, but of the entire world's population. Though there's a lot of taurine in a beef carcass, it is mostly in small muscles like the tongue, face, and tail, as well as the heart. And even so, it's still not nearly as concentrated as it is in many seafoods. In classical Greece, bone isotope analysis shows us that the diet was almost wholly animal-based. Wherever you were not eating food anything like what we have today. The modern diet was largely dreamed up in the 70s and led to the advent of the food pyramid, and this is when the American diet became very carb-heavy. It promoted very low amounts of red meat and animal fat, and concentrated mostly on grains. And many of the foods we eat today didn't even exist until very recently. In fact, every year, new abominations crawl out of the lab and onto your food table. Additives like citric acid, for example, even in their pure form, cause problems like kidney stones, but it's much worse when you factor in the fact that they're biosynthetic. That means they're grown in a vat somewhere from a culture that's fed genetically engineered soybean oil. So you're actually getting much more than just citric acid, including plenty of allergens and genetically engineered garbage. Most high fructose corn syrup is processed in China. There's little oversight in China, and food processing can be much cheaper there because they can take shortcuts without getting them into trouble. If you did that in the United States or other Western countries, you'd be in jail in a heartbeat. But they have no problem just importing all this food from a country that does all of these bad practices. That's why high fructose corn syrup often has very high levels of mercury, and they'll try and claim it's not enough mercury to cause serious problems, but you shouldn't expect to get serious problems from simply eating normal food. You expect that normal food is just healthy, and if it's not healthy, you shouldn't be eating it. If you were to look closely into the production of all the ingredients on packaged food, you get a similar story for most of them. You can tailor your diet and your dog's diet to get the proper levels of taurine and glycine, but supplementing is much easier. It will also have many benefits to push beyond what you can get through your diet, such as raising glutathione levels and lowering homocysteine, for example, which is a significant contributor to heart disease. L-cysteine, the natural active ingredient in NAC, will also help a great deal. Glycine is also important for making glutathione. I take 6 grams of taurine, 6 grams of glycine, 3 of L-cysteine, and I do it every day all in one big lump. Some sources suggest you take as much as 20 grams of glycine a day, and that is estimated to be similar to what the average American diet provided in the early 20th century. I take it all at once about an hour after eating, but ideally you would split this up throughout the day among your meals. Some people have trouble with taurine and it irritates their stomach, but if you slowly work up the dose, this problem can usually be avoided. For my dogs, I give fatty beef roast plus some thick soup made from whole chicken thighs with the bone strained out. I also give them supplemental taurine at the dosage of 100 milligrams per 10 pounds of body weight. The reason history is important is because if we don't know where we come from, how do we know where we should be trying to go?
Who am I? I don't know